Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. This is Rehan Ahmed, lecturer in English, University of Education, Lahore. In today's class, we'll be discussing some of the most important writers and poets of the 20th century. We've discussed the major characteristics of the modern poetry in the previous lecture. And in today's lecture, we'll be talking about some of the major poets and their works too. As we all know that the modern poetry, of which T.S. Eliot is the chief representative, has followed entirely a different tradition from the Romantic and Victorian tradition of poetry. And the certain ideas of this age, they are regarding the essentially poetical subjects, the poetical materials, and the poetical modes. And these preconceptions about poetry during the 19th century were mainly those which were established by great Romantic poets, Wordsworth, John Keats, Coleridge, and Shelley, etc. And as we all know that the Romantic poetry, similarly the Victorian poetry and the modern poetry, they have their own themes, they have their own conceptions, they have their own material about the literature, and these conceptions are basically interlinked with each other. And we cannot undermine any age in the history of English literature that is detached from the previous one. And we know that behind this age, many major and gigantic conceptions of the classics are working, and some of them they have followed the tradition and the literary style of those. In modern poets, as we know, there are some literary representative figures, and following are Robert Bridges, Gerard, Manley, Hopkins, Alfred Edward Haussmann, and including the George group or the Georgian poets, William Henry Davies and Lawrence Binyon. Let's start with Robert Seymour Bridges, one of the most influential figure in the 20th century poetry. As Robert Seymour Bridges was a Briton poet laureate from 1913 to 1930, Robert Bridges carried on old ideas of Victorian age and tradition, but due to his metrical innovation in poetry, he is counted as modern poet. And you can also see the influence of the Victorian poetry and Victorian conceptions on the modern poets too, because as I have already made this statement that all the previous ages, they have a strong link between and among the ages. We can see that the Shakespearean age has a strong link with the Restoration or with the Puritan age, and Puritan age has also a strong relationship with the Romanticism, and Romanticism with the Victorian age, and Victorian age with the Modernism. And we can see that this is a streamline that is coming from the ancient times. Similarly, we can see that even the Robert Seymour Bridge, he is a modern poet, but his conceptions, his influence is Victorian. And he started writing about the modern age. His subject, his major conceptions were basically the modern, but his influence was the Victorian. And we can also see that Robert Bridges, as a modern poet, stands rather apart from the current modern English words. But His work has great influence in a selected circle, and that circle can be seen when he defines the poetry in terms of purity, precision, and delicacy. And despite being a poet laureate in different regions of England, Bridges was never a very well known poet, and he also achieved his popularity shortly before his death. And the piece that he has produced through his poetry, through the literature, it was the testament of beauty. And Bridges contributed in phonetics. He was also a founder, member of the Society to Pure English. But his contribution in English was entirely with a new concept of the modern age. And then moving further, we'll be discussing some of the major characteristics of Bridges' poetry, that his poetry covers the subjects of the aristocratic society. His work was mainly associated with the leisured and highly cultivated aristocratic class. And Bridges was not the only one who talked about the high classes, who talked about the bourgeois of the society, the elite classes of the society. Rather, there were many poets and writers in the earlier ages who have talked about the bourgeois classes, about the high classes of the society. Some of them, they discussed those high classes in negative manners, and some of them they talked about in satirical manners, and some of them they talked about in a positive manner. So we can see that every poet and writer, he or she chooses different subjects, different people, different classes to talk about. So similarly, we can see that the major focus of Bridges' poetry is the aristocratic society or the aristocratic class. And then further, we can also see that in his poetry he described a world which was haunted by the memories of the classics and musical aspects and the decorous of love making. And whenever a poet talks about any particular class, he is also talking about the memories, the love, the religion, or many other aspects of the everyday life. And Bridges is also encapsulating those themes in his poetry, that we can see that he talks about the memories of the classics, the memories of the past, and the musical aspects and decorous of love making in his poetry. And what is the speciality of Bridges' poetry is that his poetry has a musical rhythm. When someone reads a verse or a couplet or a stanza from his poetry, it makes a musical composition, it makes a musical rhythm, and then we can see that it has something to do with the sonnets, something to do with the ballads that have already been written by the ancients and the classics. Then you will also see that many of his early lyrics are obviously influenced by the Elizabethan lyricist, especially those of that of Thomas Campion. And we, as a student of literature, know very well that every writer or every poet is basically having an influence on his poetry, influence of uh, any ideal personality, ideal writer, and similarly we can see that the musical rhythm that was created by Bridges in poetry, it was taken by Thomas Campion. And then in his experimental poetry, Bridges' best metrical experiment is the sprung rhythm, a kind of versification. Sprung rhythm is basically a kind of versification based on speech rhythm. As he described this experiment as the hidden emotional pattern that makes poetry. Because this pattern does not concern directly with the language, rather it is concerned with the pattern, emotional pattern in the poetry that is hidden in the lines. Because when you have to speak, when you have to read, then the emotional pattern that really makes poetry, it is the main focus, it is the concern, instead of the language, instead of the other things. So that is why the hidden emotional pattern that makes poetry, it is important in the poetry of Bridges. Moving further, we can also see that the style and diction in Bridges' work is very successive. It is very meditative. It is the strain of the Victorian love poetry. Because as we know that there is a great influence on Bridges' poetry and Bridges' work of the Victorian poets and writers, so that is why we can see that there is a meditative art, a successive progress and calmness of the Victorian love poetry in the works of Bridges. And we can see that essence. We can see that essence in the poetry of Bridges and that of Victorian. He further holds a high esteem, a high place in the ethical and intellectual principle of beauty, because he also talks about the ethical and intellectual principles of the beauty and of the society too. Then in his poem, The Testament of Beauty, he gives beautiful expression to his character and abstract idea of beauty in all things which he received from Keats. And we can also see that the Testament of Beauty is basically a permanent source of expression to his character and the abstract idea of beauty in all things which he received from Keats. Because John Keats, his ideals of love and ideals of love poetry are acceptable, are successive, are the magnum opus and a great inspiration for the modern writers. And then in his another poem, The Villager, he reflects the people of upper class who have lost the sense of common humanity. And whenever the writers, the poets, the novelists, whenever they've talked about that particular class of society, that is the high class or the elite class, they've talked about and they have dealt them as a misanthropist of the society. They seem the dislikers of the society. As it seems that the upper classes and the bourgeois classes, they are idiosyncratic, they are liking themselves, they are not concerned with the other classes of the society, with the lower middle peoples and the classes of the society. Rather, they are only concerned with their actions, with their things, with their ethics, with their moralities. So that is why Bridges has also pointed out that his poetry reflects the upper classes, and how those classes are far, far away from the common humanity. And his experiments also centered on the syllabic rather than on accent, which he developed simultaneously and independently with American poet Marianne Moore. And we can see will when we'll be looking after the examples of Bridges' poetry, we will see that how the constructions of different lines have been made, and how it is giving a syllabic rather than an accentual pace of poetry. So we will see later. The themes. In Bridges' poetry, there is war, love theme, nature, and many others. As we will be talking about only the major themes of Bridges' poetry, and that is that war, the events of First World War, including his wounding son. He has talked about the war because the war was the major event in the early 20th century. The first 2 decades, the First World War, it was occurred on 1914, and it remained, or it lasted till 1918. And as we know that there were many people who were the part of this war, many countries who were the part of this war, and this age basically became a great subject for the upcoming writers. So that is why war is the most inclusive event in the 20th century. And the events of First World War, including, as we can see, that every poet talks about his own experiences, his own his subjectivity, as he has also talked about his son Edward, who had a severe effect on Bridges' poetry, and he composed fiercely patriotic poems and letters. So we can see that his poetry was inspiring the soldiers, soldiers of the war, and he created the poetry for the military troops as well. So that is why we can see that the poetry of Bridges having the theme of war as a major theme, and he talked about some of the war experiences in his poetry. Then the love theme, and we can also see in Bridges' poetry, love is also a common thing, as Bridges has covered almost all the aspects of love. As he has covered the platonic love, it is mentioned on the slide. He has also covered the spiritual love, and he has also covered the wedded love. And we can see every type of love is discussed in Bridges' poetry. And why it is important? Because a true representative of the age is not excluding any theme, whether it is a great in importance or less in importance, so that the readers may easily get what the modern age was about, what was the lifestyle of the people about, and other things of that related to that age. So that is why a poet, being a representative of the age, he is never missing anything to talk about or to depict or to take as a subject of his work. Then nature is also one of the major themes of Bridges' poetry, as we can see that nature has also been a great subject in the Romantic age, and as we know that he is already he's also influenced by the Romantic age, by the Romantic poets also. So that is why he has also taken up a subject of nature in his poetry, and he talked about the theme of nature. And this was about the Bridges. And the next poet that we will be discussing, it is the most important literary figure. His name is Gerard Manley Hopkins. Gerard Manley Hopkins is also one of the most important literary figure of the 20th century and of the modern age. During Hopkins' lifetime, his writing was seen by no more than a handful of people, most notably Robert Bridge. We can see that he, being a writer, being a poet, did not remain very famous, whether he was not considered as a great literary poet and writer till after his death. After his death was considered to be a great writer and poet, but in his lifetime he was not considered a good writer, and there were very few people who were acclaiming and acknowledging Gerard Manley Hopkins as a poet and a writer. So that is why in his lifetime he did not cut a successive part, rather he was a not very famous. His poetry, his writings, basically, they reveal the brilliant critical faculty, scrupulous self-criticism, generous humanity, and a strong will. And we can see that his major focus is on the moralities of the societies, because every writer of this particular age is focused and intended to talk about the moralities, because the thing that we find in this age is basically the lackness of the morality. It is the ethics, the lackness of the ethics in the people, because the people were haunted by the wars. The people were basically they were facing a lot of problems due to the war, and that is why lackness of morality is seen. The other aspect that why people were actually lacked of morality, it is the religion, because as we were already discussed in the previous lecture, that the people, when they were dying, they were being murdered, they were being slaughtered by their enemies in the war. So then the people started praying by the gods to help them out, but gods, they never helped them. So the people, they felt disconnection, they felt detached by the religions, and there was a lackness of morality in that sense. So that is why in the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, there is a lackness in morality and humanity, and of a you can see the other faculties that we will be talking about. And then his friend paid a tribute to his personal integrity and his rare chastity of mind, and he has also sense of God's mystery, grandeur, mercy, and joy for all things, and he has a flexible personality with additional features of imaginative draining, deep feelings, and intellectual depth. Because why Gerard Manley Hopkins, as a great intellectual figure of the 20th century, failed in this age? He was failed because he was having the great sublime thoughts about the subjects of the common life. And at that time people were very simple, people were totally they were fed up with the intellectualities, they were fed up with the faculties, they were fed up with such things that are deeply penetrated into them. They were only seeking the moments of pleasures by reading the poetry. They were only seeking the encouragements by the representatives of the age. So that is why Gerard Manley Hopkins, who talked about the subject of the humanity in a deeper sense, he was failed in this. We cannot say that he was failed, rather he could not match the interest of the 20th century people through his poetry, because there was a lackness, there was a disconnectivity or discontinuity in the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins that is not understandable by the modern poet, by the modern people. And then his flexible personality with additional features of imaginative rearing, as we've already talked about, and feelings and intellectual path, it was also the part of his poetry too. And Hopkins sought a stronger rhetoric of verse. And the other poets who have been titled as the great literary figures of the 20th century or of the modern century, they have very simple language. They have a very simple versification in the poetry. But the rhetoric of verse of Hopkins, and in Hopkins' poetry, it was not very simple. Rather, it was sensuous. It was not easily understandable, because it was having a depth in it. It was having a deep subjects. So that is why we can say that Hopkins could not match with the interest of the people as the other literary figures of the 20th century did. And then we'll be looking at some of the characteristics of Hopkins' poetry. That what were the major subjects, what were the major themes that he talked about. As we know that Hopkins had tried to revive the sprung rhythm, the accentual and alliterative measures of Langland and skeleton, which had dropped out of use since the 16th century. And we can also see that the sprung rhythm has been used, and in that sprung rhythm the accentual and alliterative measures of Langland and skeleton were followed. And what is a sprung rhythm? Basically, when a poem is read with accentual stresses, as we have seen it in Shakespearean poetry in iambic pentameter, where there was a trochee, stress and unstressed syllabi. So that is basically the sprung rhythm in which the poetry is measured. And then Hopkins endowed with a highly sensuous temperament. So his poetry is enriched with the sensuous things, with the sensuousness, with the sensation that he talked about. His poetry is touching the hearts of the people. And then in his poetry you can also see there is a clear and a deep effect of religion too. He refined his faculty and offered it to God. He enjoyed things in deeply religious mood as the intimation of the divine presence. So there is another major concept that is basically related to the characteristics of the age that you might have studied before. That is the concept of pantheism, because the pantheism that we will see in the next slides, that pantheism is basically the divine presence of the things, the universal divinity of the when you see a universal divinity in the presence of the things. So that is why a pantheism you can see in the poetry of Hopkins, where you can see that there is something sublime, something divine, something holy, something sacred in the things around. And then his peculiarity and the immanent quality of her things, which is the manifestation of beauty, were called by Hopkins an inscape. And inscape is another important concept. It is basically a design that constitutes individual identity, because Hopkins poetry, as we already discussed about, it is related to the soul, it is related to the mind, it is related to the religion, and when it is related with such things, then it will be having some deeper meanings of man's existence, or of human beings' existence. So that is why it is basically it is the manifestation of beauty, and that is called inscape by Hopkins. And it is a design, it is a system that constitutes an individual's personality and individual's identity. And then all the poems of Hopkins are about God, nature, and man. We can also see that there is a great influence of Walt Whitman on Hopkins, on Gerard Manley Hopkins, because as Gerard has talked about the pantheistic art, the pantheism, the love and the presence and the sacredness in the things. Similarly, as Walt Whitman had done in his essays. So that is why we can see that there is an inscape and a design, an inner system that constitutes an individual personality of the reader and of the other people. So that is why we can see the presence of the God, the presence of the nature, then the presence of the sacred things in man. So that is why Gerard's poetry is important in that sense. So let's talk about the style and diction, because we are shortening of the time, but I'll be hoping so that we will cover this lecture in the given time. So style and diction of Hopkins, as Hopkins used in his poetry a rhythmic meter drawn out by two currents, undercurrent and overcurrent. And you can see this undercurrent or overcurrent on by consulting these two styles on internet. But let's talk about the other concepts, because this rhythmic meter, it will be understandable when you will be looking at the pattern of the poetry, and you cannot understand what is undercurrent and overcurrent verbally. Rather, you can understand these terms when you will be consulting them and by looking at the pattern of the poetry. So sometimes Hopkins produce same line confronting by using meter foot to its opposite, for instance an iambic followed by trochee. So these are basically the terms, the poetic or the stylistic terms. Those are you can say the style of any writer, that how he or she manages to convey an idea through the style or through the diction. So this is basically the tool, or this is basically the expression of any poet, that how he or she conveys his idea through the style and through the expression of the language. So that is why we can see that he has used a rhythmic meter drawn by the currents and the other trochees or the parameter, the measures of the poetry. And we've already talked about the sprung rhythm, and let's talk about, instead of talking about the same things as we already discussed, let's talk about the writings, that how Hopkins' writings were enriched with the major conceptions of with the major subjects of the age. As we can see that there is an existence of God. One of the major themes, as explored by Hopkins in his poem, is the presence of God in all his creations, because this is a concept that is basically the pantheism. because when you see the presence or the existence of the god in all the things around you, then you can find there is a presence and the existence of the god, and this concept is called pantheism. And in other words, the manifestation of God in nature, because the proof of God's existence is neither from the evidence of the external world nor from direct intuition. It is the logical deduction from the fact of one's own uniqueness. Because what one feels about the subjects around him, this is basically concerned with that thing. And if a person is internally connected with the things around him, then he can understand, or he may understand, the true existence of the god. So that is why the existence of the god is seen in Hopkins' poetry. But when one finds a connection of his soul with the other things around him, then the existence of the god can be ensured. And then let's talk about the next poet, Alfred Edward Haussmann. He is also one of the most influential English poet of this age, and he described textual criticism about science and an art requiring reason and common sense. And his critical evaluation of Haussmann in 2 decades after his death is tinged with the anti-romanticism of the period. The directness and simplicity of much of Haussmann's poetry was viewed as false, because the people of this age, they were not accepting any specific poet, whether that poet is having all the qualities of the ancient classics, or of the classical writers, or the one who is having the qualities and the characteristics of the present age. Because the people, they were totally fed up. They were not into their sensation. They were feeling dejected all the time. So that is why we can say that they are not accepting anyone who is having the extreme position in the society, and not that one too who is having a low position in the society. So the one who is actually talking about the major subjects of society, that poet is also rejected by the people. And the one who is taking the subjects of the rural life, of the village life, that poet is also not accepted by the people, because the people of that age, of that particular age, were haunted by the wars. Then let's talk about the characteristics of Haussmann's poetry, because Haussmann is having the characteristics around him in his poetry, as we can easily find. Some of them are very important. That Haussmann's poetry was disgusted with the dismal picture with the modern world presented, but he did not possess an acute intellect to solve this problem. Haussmann's poetry, he was found as a pessimistic poet rather a optimistic, because his poetry was full of hopelessness. His poetry was full of pessimism. He was actually displaying a picture of the 20th century society in a very dismal way, in a very sad way, in a very pessimistic way. So the people of that age, that particular age, were displayed as the pessimistic beings, or as the desperate beings. So that is why we can see that his poetry was full of pessimism and the pessimistic elements. And we can also see that his poetry has an expression of horrible destruction caused by the modern wars, utter futility and inhumanity. And his poetry, or his poetic expression, was also horrible. It was based on the destruction, because in that age there was a war, and that war elements and war theme was also discussed by many poets in that age. And the war was also affecting the minds of the peoples, the minds of the common human beings in that age. So that is why we can see that war element, or the theme of war, was also affecting the lives of the people. Then the style and diction, as we can say, the language and the style of Haussmann is perhaps very enigmatic. He is very, you can say, he's using the language, he's using the quality and expressions of his feelings into the poetry, and that is a very simple subject, because when you talk about something, you talk about your experiences, you talk about your internal life, internal insight of your soul, then it is, you can say, very easy for yourself to talk about them, but might be sometimes it is not easy to understand by the common readers or by the other people. Rather, we can say that he was having a mastery over his language, and his style was very euphemistic. His style was very concise, and as sometimes it seems that he was following Francis Bacon, because like Francis Bacon, his style was also to talk in proverbs, to talk in the short sentences, but with having a deep wit, with having a deep understandings of the things. Then further, he demonstrates his style fearlessly with genuine feelings by peeking out of syntactically balanced attempts at wit. And Haussmann's most autobiographical lines occur. His style is unlike any of his other works, free of epigrams, as we talked about his style of epigram, that he writes brief but witty but intellectual, and clever rhymes. His description of the dead character allows you to read his own heart condition, as we can see through his poetry, as his poetry is basically autobiographical, and you can see there is an insight of his own life in his poetry, and you can understand through his poetry that what he has to talk about, and what Haussmann is talking about himself and talking about the other people. And then let's talk about the themes. Death, as we can also see that death, pessimism, and such sober and serious subjects and themes are basically of Haussmann's poetry. And we can see that death is basically his poems explicitly expressing his belief that an awareness of the brevity of life leads to a desire to experience it more intensely. And in many of his poems, he talked about the death. He talked about that how one's soul can be released from the cages of the life, and how the transience and decay leads to the desire for the release of death rather than a more meaningful participation in life. So we can see that the theme death is basically is a major concept in Haussmann's poetry. And the pessimism, because when when a poet talks about the death theme, so death theme is also a pessimistic element. Death theme talks about the pessimism and the hopelessness of that particular writer. So that is why pessimism is basically the second major theme in his poetry, and it is the second element of the theme, and that has led many critics to dismiss Haussmann as a bitter pessimist who exposes the tragic side of life. It is clear, in fact, in examining the view of life that contained in many his poems as the loveliest of trees, that to regard Haussmann merely as a pessimist is to oversimplify a more complex attitude. So that is why we can say that many of the critics, they are having this view in their mind that Haussmann is not a bitter pessimist, rather he is a pessimist, and who thinks and talks about the common life of the society with a pessimistic view. And then he has also talked about the military troops, and he talked about the soldiers, and this also remained a major theme of Hopkins' poetry, because as we know that there is a context and a strong background of war behind this all. So now let's talk about the last section of the lecture, in which we will discuss the Georgian poets. As we all know that beside Bridges and Haussmann and Hopkins, we do have some Georgian poets who are actually who do fall in the George group, and they are also called as the Georgian poets. And we can also see that these poets flourished in the reign of George V, 1911 to 1936, and they possessed various characteristics and were not conscious of belonging to a particular group. So in reality, they were the imitators of the parts, who shut their eyes against the contemporary problems, but they were presumptuous enough to think of themselves as the heralds of a new age. So that is why we'll be talking about Georgian poets and their conceptions, in which we will also see that the Georgian recommendations were the discarding of archaistic, the old-fashioned language and the diction that was being used in the modern poetry, as thee, thou, flowered, and whenever. So we can see that such conceptions and such language expressions, those were found very old fashioned in the modern era. Those were basically discarded, those were rejected by these Georgian poets, that they recommended that such expressions must not be used, because these are the old expressions, and they must not be used. But the Georgians, they also avoided from all formally religious, philosophic, or improving themes like sad and direct cafe table ideas. So they were not, even though the common people, and they were not prone to talk about, they were not intent to talk about the common things and the common themes of society as well, and they were not prone to talk about the trivial and the follies of the society. So that is why we can say that they talked about they do not talk about the religious and philosophical themes instead of the other ideals of the society. And they were also basically the some of them, they were not aggressively imperialistic, so they were pantheistic, that according to them that universe is divine, and rather than in entheistic, rather than they would not be believing on the godly things or the existence of the god. So they were actually believing on the pantheism. They were believing on that this whole universe, or the things around them, they have a sacred existence. So that is why this was the view of the Georgian poets. And what was the other thing? It was basically the subject of writing. Their subject were of writing were nature, love, leisure, old age, childhood, and animals. Basically, these were the major conceptions of their poetry and of their writing. So that is why they focused on such major themes instead of talking about the philosophical things and the religious things and the societal things. So they talked about such things of the society. And they were also concerned with the romantic ideas, and they were having some romantic characters in their poetry, and those romantic characters were based on the pace and the interest of the romantic poets and their poetry. So that is why we can say that they were more focused they were focused on the romanticism or the ideas of the romanticism, and they also included the other major themes of the society that we already discussed. And then it was also believed that the Georgian poetry is meant for nice people, because it is a kind of poetry which is lacking in depth and originality, and so unfit for the thoughtful readers in the modern complex age. So similarly, as we've already talked about the modern poets like Hopkins, Robert, and other notable poets, so we've talked about that in that complex age, in that age that was actually haunted by the wars, it was not an easy thing to encourage the people, or to motivate the people. Similarly, we can also see that the Georgian poetry, it was meant for the nice people, and it was those nice people who were not the part of the war, and it was not basically for the readers, for the common readers who were actually haunted by the wars, and who were having the complexity, who were actually dying from hunger, and the one who was actually concerning about their livelihood. So this poetry was not about them. Their poetry was only for the nice people, for the elite people, for the elite classes. So that is why we can see that the theme of commonality or of the humanity is missing from the poetry of the Georgian poets. And their anthologies represented the work of as many as 40 poets, but none of them as a really major one. Because similarly, this idea of Georgian poet is somehow seem to be influenced by the Spencer school of thought. As we can see, it was also an idea that was influenced by the university wits. Like they are basically the group of the people who are critically evaluating the works and literature of the other people, the works of the other people. So that is why we cannot see that they particularly and specifically talking about one subject. Rather, they are talking about every subject of the humanity, and their poetry is not about one man, rather about one class. Rather, they are actually talking about every class of the society, but specifically of the elite class of the society. And in today's lecture, we've talked about the modern poets and their works in detail. We've also talked about the Georgian poets and their major subjects and themes and works. And I hope so. This would have a knowledgeable thing for you to talk about and to discuss all these things in detail. And thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.